Hello and welcome to Experimental Gameology. My name's James. Today I'm going to talk about how to use Chainmail, the war game, to play original Dungeons & Dragons. As before, I've used the cheap PDFs available from DM's Guild. And what I'm about to say is based on my own game experiments. And I got a lot of support from the lovely people at the OD&D 7.4 Pro Boards forum, who are always more than happy to answer your questions about how to play Chainmail or original Dungeons & Dragons. So first of all, why should you play OD&D with Chainmail? Well, apart from the fact that the book tells you to, in the suggested equipment, it mentions that Chainmail is something which is recommended. And there are about 24 mentions of Chainmail throughout the OD&D books. Also, more practically perhaps, the OD&D books are famous for having some holes, some things left unexplained, and some of those holes can certainly be filled with rules from Chainmail. And lastly, the reason you do any experiments with old games, any playing new games, is to have fun. And I certainly found it fun to try to use some of the Chainmail rules whilst playing original Dungeons & Dragons, to offer that to my friends, to offer it at cons, and just for my own enjoyment. So what are the holes in the original Dungeons & Dragons rules that can be filled out with Chainmail? I would say there's 3 I want to talk about today. The first is turn structure, or possibly initiative you could call it. The second is morale resolution. And the third is combat. So let's take the first one, turn structure. There is actually no mention of turn structure initiative in the original Dungeons & Dragons rules. In the second issue of the Strategic Review, which is the predecessor of Dragon Magazine, Gary Gygax does touch on the subject, and in the example of play he gives, he basically says roll a d6, add your dexterity modifier, and that will give you who gets the first hit. However, as I've said before in my video about how to play Chainmail, which I recommend you watch if you haven't yet, there are 2 morale systems in Chainmail. There's the move-counter-move system, and there's a simultaneous movement system. I have played the move-counter-move system with OD&D, and it basically works. The difference from later versions is that the roll only determines who chooses who moves first, and then each step then happens simultaneously between the 2 players. There is also a second system, the simultaneous movement system, where basically you write written orders. I've never done that, but I think it could also be possible. It takes a bit more time, obviously, but it maybe adds more the element of surprise. So the second system, which I think is somewhat lacking in the original Dungeons & Dragons books, is morale. Now, it's mentioned quite a lot. NPC morale is mentioned. There are magic items and spells and monster descriptions that all mention morale, modifiers to morale, not rolling morale. But there isn't a comprehensive system for morale given in the first 3 books. There are some hints at it. So when talking about NPC loyalty, it says you can then use the reaction table to determine morale. But of course, you would have to interpret what, for example, accept offer means. Presume that just means a positive response. And similarly, because originally the reaction table was reaction to being hired, not morale. And similarly, there's a reaction table given for monsters in the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, a bit simpler. I believe actually this is a system used by quite a lot of OD&D gamers these days. Just basically low is bad, high is good, and the DM decides what that means. So those are the hints at morale which are given in the book. However, as I've said before, Chainmail contains a number of morale systems. So there's the post-melee morale, which is rather complicated. There's morale when being charged by cavalry. And then the system which I have used in my games is the instability due to excess casualties. Again, you can see that in my video demonstrating how Chainmail works. Essentially, there's a table with percentage of losses before you roll morale, and then you do it again when they lose that many again. And there are numbers that have to be rolled or better on 2d6 to pass the test. The difficulty is that you have to then assign these numbers to other troop types. This is just for historical types. It's with humanoids, it's kind of easy. You can see how they attack and how they defend. With monsters and so on, you have to probably use a bit more imagination, but it is possible, I think, and it's a workable system. It's kind of similar to, again, what ends up in BX, although it's inverted, and there's this variable level of casualties, which is quite nice. You could use also either of the other two systems, right, which are in Chainmail, the post-melee morale or the cavalry charge table. Indeed, I believe it's in like a spell description or no, drums of deafening or something. It's in a magic item description, which I'm not going to try and find now, but it says there, use a magic save as a morale check, right? So again, people were thinking very modularly. Yeah? So a morale check could be any kind of roll, which just checked whether the person remained on the field or not. And then finally, talking about combat. So famously, OD&D has the alternative combat system, which has then effectively become the combat system for all later versions of D&D, in that you roll a d20 against a hit number. That obviously took off, but it is mentioned, as an alternative to what? To Chainmail. So you could use Chainmail, and you can use it in different ways for combat. And I'm just going to go through the different ways which I've used. First of all, there's the man-to-man melee table. I actually tried this first. It seemed to me kind of logical to try it first. But I mean, it's armor type against weapon type, rolled on 2d6. There are rather complicated rules for parrying and number of attacks. But it works well with humanoid figures where you can see their armor, see their weapon, and their first level, and they haven't got any special attacks. As you go up in level, as there are special attacks involved, as there are monsters which are not statted, you have to use more discretion. I did that with the monsters. I, for example, gave a giant spider 2 attacks as if with a short sword for its 2 kind of front leg attacks. And for the rust monster, I made its tail into like a flail attack. You can also decide about the armor, if you sort of map it onto the armor class, or if you make decisions about, well, I think this monster's armor is like plate mail or whatever. Sorry, plate armor, my mistake. Then there's the normal system, yes, the mass melee system, which I've described also in my Chainmail videos. Probably this is what, almost certainly in fact, this is what Dave Arneson used in his Blackmore campaign. It works well when there's lots of figures. I mean, that's what it's designed for. Also in Strategic Review 2, Gygax, says if you're doing smaller scale, use the alternative combat system. But it does work well with larger figures. It can be done with smaller figures. You just have to convert everyone to the type that they would be. You can give them bonuses still based on their level and so on. And you can use them. You use a part of the table which says fight as 2 men, then that's what you use. You use them as 2 men. So it can be done, but it's probably recommended more for mass combat, and that's how I've done it really. When I've used it, I've switched up to the this table when there's been like 20 aside or something. It's pretty deadly, and you also have to decide, is a hit a kill as it is in Chainmail, or is it a loss of 1 hit dice, or is it a roll a d6 and take that away from the hit points? As always, there's some interpretation. Then there's missile. There's the mass missile, which I've talked about before. Also quick and deadly, also really designed for bigger units. And then there's the individual fire with missiles. Again, it's very similar to the man-to-man. It's weapon type against armor type. And in fact, the armor classes given, somewhat confusingly, are not the OD&D armor classes, but it's just a reference to the columns of the table above. So armor class 1 is no armor, armor class 2 is leather or padded, armor class 3 is shield. And also we see, in fact, that in contrast to later versions of D&D, a shield is considered better than leather armor. It works pretty well. Again, it's 2d6. And there is evidence, in fact, from things like alarms and excursions, the early zine, that people would be using the alternative combat system for melee and probably the individual fire with missiles table, certainly some missiles rules from Chainmail for missiles. There are other tables in the book. There's the fantasy table, there's the jousting table, but honestly, I haven't used those in games. I guess the fantasy table wouldn't come up much because it's big monster versus big monster. It wouldn't come up much in a role-playing game, and jousting matrix is probably a good thing to crack out when you do the wilderness adventuring. It's specifically mentioned that a knight can call you to a joust and so on. But I haven't done it, so I don't want to talk about it at length. So finally, I just want to say that the main take-home, I think, is that Chainmail gives you a choice of systems which plug some of the gaps in old Dungeons & Dragons, but when you start to try and use Chainmail in this way, you will find other gaps which you need to fill yourself. So, for example, if you do choose to use the morale system, instability due to excess casualties, you then have to give stats to other figures which are not mentioned. If you do decide to use the man-to-man, you have to give weapons for monster attacks and so on. I guess the alternative combat system is the simplest, most widely applicable, requires the least thinking in this sense of how it works, because it's just armor class against hit dice or level. So I guess that's why it caught on. However, there's no need to choose just one system. And indeed, in the OD&D books, it says, for example, when boarding ships, you can use man-to-man. And, you could use man-to-man for like a pit fight between warriors. You could use the alternative combat system from OD&D for just dungeon crawling. But if the numbers on either side get big and you turn into a skirmish, then you can go to the normal system, for example. So I think that's probably what people did, as well as I've mentioned in other videos. I think people played in a kind of modular way and would happily drop in rules for different parts of the game. So I hope that's been helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Also, if you've tried it yourself, I'd be interested to know your experience, what's worked for you. And please like and subscribe. And I hope to be making more content now that we're slowly coming out of COVID, at least where I'm living.